In the three Baltic republics of Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia, which had only been occupied by the Russians in 1940, memories of their own national independence were still quite fresh. Lithuanians, Latvians and Estonians had therefore immediately offered help to the German liberating armies, in the hope of thereby restoring their country's independence. Ukrainians, Caucasians and tribes of Turkish origin believed that in addition to being liberated from Stalin's yoke, they would see their own nationalist aspirations fulfilled, even if these did not always go so far as many of their former leaders, now living in exile, would have liked. After 20 years of arbitrary injustice and terror, the re-establishment of elementary human rights such as the dignity of man, liberty, justice, and the sanctity of property united every inhabitant of the Soviet Empire, insofar as he was not directly working for the Moscow system, in a common readiness to support the Germans. What could be more natural for us than to exploit this readiness? By extending an honest offer to the Russian peoples and following it up in the appropriate way, it would have been possible to unleash a war of liberation, which almost certainly would have ended in a rapid and satisfactory conclusion of the Russian campaign. Our military commanders in the field had already made a start in this direction, more from a healthy instinct of self-preservation than for any political motives. As we could not replace all our losses rapidly, and the endless Russian expanses made increasing demands on our manpower, our commanders recruited Russians, Ukrainians and other nationals as auxiliaries and volunteers for various types of duty. These Hilfswillige voluntarily acted as drivers, ammunition carriers, cooks and interpreters and the like. The number of such auxiliaries could never be exactly determined, since the individual commanders would frequently avoid reporting precisely how many they had. By mid-1943, however, there were about 320,000, of which a large number were actually fighting alongside our troops. The 18th Army alone had 47,000 Hiwis. In addition, there were other signs of a Russian initiative which we could put to political use against Moscow. In the German-occupied city of Smolensk, for example, a committee of Russians had come together and offered to set up a Russian nationalist government and recruit a Russian army of liberation of about 1 million strong to fight against Stalin. Recognizing that the enemy situation called for a clear overall political line, Field Marshal von Bock and other commanders gave initial support to the Smolensk Committee's proposals. But these proposals were turned down by Hitler, as were similar suggestions put forward by the Lithuanians, Latvians and Estonians. Army Group Center also argued in favor of replacing its personnel deficiencies by recruiting 200,000 Russian auxiliaries. Brauchitsch described this proposal as being of decisive importance, but it was never put into effect, as both he and Bock were relieved of their commands for other reasons in December 1941. I recall having a number of discussions with Halder and other leading general staff officers in the winter of 1941 to 1942. We agreed that there was an urgent necessity for the clear formulation of political war aims, together with a radical alteration in our occupation policies toward the Russian population. Under the pressure of events, the frontline commanders also called for an immediate solution. Those of us directly involved in these discussions anticipated that the worsening military situation would force Hitler to modify his views, and that consequently there would be a change in the current occupation policies. With Halder's approval, we therefore took every step necessary to speed up such a decision. Those of us who were most concerned in this controversy were the heads of the operations branch, Huissinger, of Foreign Armies East, myself, the Quartermaster General, Wagner, and several others. This group's first action was to regularize all the native auxiliary and volunteer units, and to regulate their victualling, pay, and the individual commanders would frequently avoid reporting precisely how many they had. By mid-1943, however, there were about 320,000, of which a large number were actually fighting alongside our troops. The 18th Army alone had 47,000 Hiwis. In addition, there were other signs of a Russian initiative which we could put to political use against Moscow. In the German-occupied city of Smolensk, for example, a committee of Russians had come together and offered to set up a Russian nationalist government and recruit a Russian army of liberation of about 1 million strong to fight against Stalin. Recognizing that the enemy situation called for a clear overall political line, Field Marshal von Bock and other commanders gave initial support to the Smolensk Committee's proposals. But these proposals were turned down by Hitler, as were similar suggestions put forward by the Lithuanians, Latvians and Estonians. Army Group Centre also argued in favour of replacing its personnel deficiencies by recruiting 200,000 Russian auxiliaries. Brauchitsch described this proposal as being of decisive importance, but it was never put into effect, as both he and Bock were relieved of their commands for other reasons, in December 1941. I recall having a number of discussions with Halder and other leading General Staff officers in the winter of 1941 to 1942. We agreed that there was an urgent necessity for the clear formulation of political war aims, together with a radical alteration in our occupation policies toward the Russian population. Under the pressure of events, the frontline commanders also called for an immediate solution. Those of us directly involved in these discussions anticipated that the worsening military situation would force Hitler to modify his views, and that consequently there would be a change in the current occupation policies. With Halder's approval, we therefore took every step necessary to speed up such a decision. Those of us who were most concerned in this controversy were the heads of the operations branch, Heusinger, of Foreign Armies East, myself, the Quartermaster General, Wagner, and several others. This group's first action was to regularize all the native auxiliary and volunteer units and to regulate their victualling, pay and position vis-à-vis the German troops. An order was drafted permitting our divisions on the Eastern Front to recruit and feed about 3,000 to 4,000 native auxiliaries each. Previous actions of this kind had resulted from the individual initiative of the field commanders. This was a great help in that while our German personnel losses could never be entirely recouped in quantity or quality, the fighting fitness of the divisions in the front line would remain sufficient to continue the battle, assuming there were a number of changes in our political and military policies. By the beginning of 1942, however, Hitler had still not agreed to modify his political objectives along the lines I have described. Far from it, for by the spring he had decided on his vast offensive towards the Volga and the oil fields of the Caucasus, and this had run into strong military opposition, as I have described. If this campaign were to continue, our long supply lines to the front, which had been under constant threat since the winter from partisan warfare, would inevitably become overextended. If the Russians were to make a stand and hold us, we would lose even more men and material. But if the enemy were to withdraw, taking all his forces and equipment with him, we would have to pacify and secure enormous areas. And since the existing Russian population in the areas we occupied continued to outnumber us, this task could be performed only if we could gain their friendship and recruit from among them. In the early summer of 1942, the Russian Lieutenant General Andrei Andreevich Vlasov had fallen into our hands on the Eastern Front near Volkhov. Vlasov was one of the Soviet army commanders who had successfully defended Moscow against the German onslaught, commanding the 20th Army under Zhukov's overall leadership. Soviet propaganda had made his name and face famous throughout the Red Army, which made what was to follow all the more painful for the Moscow leaders. We soon learned that it was Vlasov's dream to lead a Russian National Army of Liberation into the Soviet Union. In September 1942, while still a prisoner of war, he put his name to a proclamation released as a leaflet over the Russian lines, appealing to the officers and men of the Red Army. Tens of thousands of them answered the call and surrendered to German units within a few days. All this confirmed just what the Soviet experts of my branch, Foreign Armies East, had reported and suggested to Chief of Staff Halder. Colonel von Roener's group, particularly Captain Strickfeld, contributed most to these suggestions. The success of the Vlasov proclamation was not without its impact on the senior officers, who had at first been somewhat reserved toward this approach. Thus, the conviction grew that General Vlasov, who certainly never went out of his way to flatter the Germans, and never left any doubt but that he was collaborating with us only for the sake of Russian national independence, might be the man to fight for and build a new and different Russia with German aid. I later met him myself. He made a very forthright and reliable impression. His voice was firm and clear, and his language betrayed a fine intellect. Above all, his military ability was testified to by his experience in the battles for Kiev and Moscow. Hitler, however, lacked all sense of reality. He was either unable or unwilling to deviate from his faulty political and military intentions for the conduct of the Russian campaign. Neither Halder nor Zeitzler was able to change his views. Hitler saw Vlasov at most as a propaganda tool to weaken the Soviet armed forces. Promises might be given to him and to deserters who came over to join him, but on no account should these promises be kept. The German officers who negotiated with Vlasov faithfully reported Hitler's attitude to him, but they nevertheless persisted in their efforts to make common cause with him in fighting both Stalin and the ignorance of the Nazi leaders, as they believed this to be the quickest route to peace and the ultimate liberation of the Russian peoples. After much hesitation, and despite overwhelming doubts, Vlasov agreed. From this alliance between German and Russian officers, there emerged what was to become known as the Vlasov movement. The movement was only one tragic stone in the mosaic of the war, and it is a matter for conjecture whether, had it flourished, it could have saved Germany from the ultimate total defeat once the United States was ready to intervene in strength. Vlasov was transferred to the High Command, OKW, in Berlin in October 1942, and shortly thereafter released from prisoner of war status. He was given the opportunity to collect a staff of fellow workers. Hitler had placed no restriction on this OKW propaganda effort, since one of the slogans under which the Russian campaign had been launched was already the liberation of the Russian peoples. The German field commands and the Russians themselves had at first believed in this slogan until early in 1943, when they found out how wide was the gulf between propaganda and reality. From this propaganda headquarters, Vlasov and his staff were able to appeal to the Russian population on both sides of the front line, to the public, the volunteers, the prisoners of war, and the Eastern workers, some 80 million people all told. We received the clearest indications that even the Soviet Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky was only awaiting the right moment to come out openly against the Stalin regime. It looked like a tremendous step in the right direction. When we approached the Foreign Ministry with our view that the war could be won only if the Russian people actively threw in their lot with us, Count von der Schulenburg, our former ambassador in Moscow, and his councillor Gustav Hilger, took up the cause and championed our proposals. However, they encountered either complete lack of sympathy or a paralytic terror of undertaking anything that was without the permission of Ribbentrop and Hitler, let alone anything diametrically opposing their orders. At the same time, both Colonel von Altenstadt, of the Quartermaster General's branch, and I drew up studies stressing the necessity of psychological and political warfare in the East. We called for new methods of dealing with the partisan plague. The studies were highly praised and widely discussed and entirely without effect. Hitler personally issued orders for the ruthless liquidation of all partisans, regardless of whether they were willing to surrender or desert to us or not. These orders resulted in a further escalation of the partisan conflict and a renewed embitterment of the population toward everything German. Strickfeld delivered a lecture entitled The Russian Character, which, in contrast to Hitler's views, must have appeared almost revolutionary. But I had it duplicated and distributed to every division on the Eastern Front and to the prison camps, which came under the Quartermaster General, as well. The document called for an understanding of the Russian mentality, and its general tenor was that the Russian must be won over for our cause. If we could not win him, we would have to rule by brute force. If we were to win him, we must set an example in word and deed. This was, of course, all aimed primarily at the eyes and ears of our German troops. In the autumn of 1942, Colonel Stief and Major Count von Stauffenberg of our organization branch approved the activation of a Russian propaganda section. Thus, there was officially born the Russian Leadership Center at Dabendorf, a prison camp south of Berlin, ostensibly still purely a propaganda exercise. There, Russian officers and propaganda workers were trained, a skeleton officer corps was established, and Russian newspapers were printed. There also, in conjunction with the OKW's military propaganda unit and Foreign Armies East, the political and military objectives for a Russian liberation movement were worked out. At the suggestion of the head of the operations branch, an official command post of General in Command of Volunteer Units was activated by Halder in conjunction with his organization branch, under Stauffenberg. The first incumbent was General Heinz Helmich, who had been in Russian captivity in World War I. His successor was General Kostring. As a result of the work of these various officers, of Vlasov's own work, and the initiative of our frontline commanders in the East, by early 1943, we had between 130,000 and 150,000 Eastern troops, organized into 176 battalions and 38 independent companies. At that time, as a result of a policy decision higher up, there was no amalgamation of these into larger formations. See the chart on page 86 for a breakdown of our Eastern troops as of early 1943. As early as August 1942, von Roener and Colonel von Tresckow, Chief of Staff of Army Group Center, had decided to resuscitate the Smolensk Committee. But when Hitler heard of it, he forbade the plan, and the committee was permitted to exist as a fictional body only. Vlasov's staff and the OKW's military propaganda section drew up a proclamation for the Smolensk Committee, and this was signed by Vlasov and General Vasily Malishkin at the end of October 1942, ready to be broadcast in millions of leaflets on both sides of the Russian lines as the Stalingrad battle approached its terrible climax. The proclamation moulded for many months in a drawer in Rosenberg's ministry, and does not appear to have been brought to Rosenberg's attention until the disaster of Stalingrad was over. Not until February 12, 1943, did he authorize its distribution, and that same evening Captain von Grothe ordered the printing of the millions of leaflets. This lack of action wrecked the General Staff's plan to test the effect of coupling military and political initiative in the Caucasus campaign. Under the pressure of military events, we did finally succeed in forcing a conference at Rosenberg's ministry in December 1942 to discuss the whole problem. The Wehrmacht was represented in strength at the conference and spoke out unmistakably for completely new political objectives in Russia. Most of them seemed to believe that Rosenberg, a Baltic German, was himself the father of Hitler's Russian policies. Rosenberg was clearly impressed by what he heard at the conference and promised to support these proposals to Hitler, although he was still unwilling to deviate from some of his own ideas, which tended toward dividing the Soviet Union into separate national entities, such as the Ukraine. Rosenberg's subsequent discussion with Hitler was a complete failure, as Hitler waved aside all his arguments with a few well-chosen and final words. Colonel Martin, head of the OKW military propaganda section, persuaded Goebbels to agree to a meeting with Vlasov to discuss a new manifesto composed for the Russian peoples. Goebbels had already recognized that the menacing trend in the war demanded nothing short of an about-face in the Third Reich's attitude toward Russia. It was characteristic of the petty jealousies prevalent at the top that Rosenberg now flatly forbade Goebbels to interfere in his affairs. And by the time Vlasov finally saw Goebbels, it was already 1945, and much too late. In the spring of 1943, General Vlasov visited the Eastern Front at the suggestion of Foreign Armies East. At the end of February, he paid a 2-week visit to units of Army Group Center, and in April he spent some days with Army Group North. He made speeches to the Russian battalions and to the local Russian population, and was received everywhere with open arms. After many grim experiences, the Russians now saw in him the only token of a future freedom, the guarantee of a better future. They no longer trusted the Germans as they had a year before. Keitel, however, found Vlasov's brazen conduct in delivering speeches outlining Russian nationalistic policies quite intolerable. On April 18th, he ordered Vlasov's return to prison camp and threatened that if he continued his conduct, he would be turned over to the Gestapo. We managed to prevent the worst excesses against him, and it was all we could do to salvage the beginnings we had made with our Russian liberation movement. We had managed to convince General Zeitzler that our ideas were right, and he approved a major propaganda operation designed to step up the Russian desertion rate at the same time as we launched our next big offensive, Operation Citadel. We codenamed the operation Silver Lining and trained 1,500 officers and propaganda workers specially for it at the Dabendorf training camp. A key element of the operation was that the deserters had to be welcomed, where possible, by Russian reception teams. A special leaflet was designed with a facsimile of my signature, instructing all our troops to treat deserters particularly well and find out if they wished to join the Russian Liberation Army. Citadel was planned to commence at dawn on May 6th, so on the evening of May 3rd, we issued the code word Silver Lining. The 18 million leaflets were to be released over Russian lines as the offensive began. There was a last-moment panic when we learned that Silver Lining was a long-existing Luftwaffe code word for commencing poison gas warfare, but this caused no real problems. As it turned out, Citadel was postponed for 2 months, and our Silver Lining operation, which began without the accompanying military offensive on the night of May 6th, went off at half-cock. It resulted in hundreds of deserters, but not the many thousands we had confidently expected. When Hitler learned that the Russian nationalist policies propagated by Vlasov were threatening to get a firm foothold among the Russian auxiliaries aiding the German cause, he called a conference with Keitel and Zeitzler on June 8, 1943, at the Berghof in Berchtesgaden, and destroyed all our hopes. "One thing has to be prevented," said Hitler, "that anybody on our own side gets any wrong ideas. We have to draw a clear distinction between the propaganda we broadcast to the other side and what we really propose to do." Hitler persisted in his stubborn opposition to the plan for a real army of Russian troops under Vlasov's command, and he prohibited any concrete promises to them on the future of Russia after the German victory he even now expected. He permitted the Phantom Propaganda Army, using Vlasov's name, to march on for propaganda reasons, and we could tell how much anxiety this caused Moscow, for we rounded up many Soviet agents parachuted behind our lines with explicit orders to infiltrate that army at all costs, and to bring Vlasov back dead or alive into communist hands. Moscow produced several anti-Vlasov leaflets, but faced with the dilemma of releasing them by the million from the air and giving Vlasov still wider publicity in the Soviet forces, they chose instead to have squads of agents in key areas distribute them by hand. In the end, Vlasov was denied success. We had sensed from the autumn of 1943 onward that the Russian liberation movement was at an end. Hitler decided to disarm all the foreign units and turn them over to the labor service, alleging that their desertion rate was too high. Within a few days, Colonel Herer, who had been appointed Chief of Staff to the General of Volunteer Units, countered Hitler's order with clear proof that the accusations levelled at his volunteers were untrue. The desertion rate was no greater than in any German unit, he pointed out, and he stated that there was nothing out of the ordinary that could have justified Hitler's order. Against this had to be set the fact that in view of the military and logistics problems, any dissolution of the foreign units would have catastrophic consequences for the German Eastern Front. Even Keitel showed he had doubts in this respect. In mid-October, the decision was modified, so that the foreign units were instead transferred to the Western Front, and Hitler waived the order that they were to be disarmed by force. This decision of Hitler's proved once again his inability to understand warfare as Clausewitz did. Through this order, the General Staff lost its sole means of introducing psychological warfare into the conflict on the Eastern Front. The transfer of the foreign units to the Western Front from the end of 1943 onward was further proof of the insincerity and hollowness of Hitler's Ostpolitik. In any case, since he had not managed to persuade our allies, the Italians, Romanians and Hungarians, to defend their fatherlands on the Don and the Volga, how could he expect the Caucasians to fight any better if they were assigned to the Atlantic Wall? They rightly interpreted this as a lack of confidence in their reliability and as proof that the Germans lacked the will to cooperate with them. From early 1944 onward, we had other worries on our minds. Himmler and his SD began to take an interest in the Vlasov movement. He sensed in this movement a rival to the non-German divisions of the Waffen-SS, the so-called volunteer divisions. Above all, he saw it as an obstacle to his plans to settle and administer a Slav colonial empire in the future. All this meant that foreign armies east, the OKW's military propaganda section, and the Abwehr frequently had to restrain the SS from interfering. A veritable war broke out on several fronts, which was ultimately at the expense of our effort in the east. Himmler's attitude unexpectedly changed in August 1944. Unabashed by the fact that he was the brain behind the subhuman theories of the Third Reich, and that the year before he had still referred to General Vlasov as a traitor and a Russian swine, the rapidly deteriorating war situation now forced Himmler to adopt the exact line that my staff and I had long been preaching, and which the SD had fought against tooth and nail. Despite Rosenberg's protests, in which Rosenberg had the support of Keitel, Himmler sanctioned the creation of a Committee for the Liberation of the Russian Peoples, with General Vlasov at its head. At first, he promised the general 10 divisions under his direct command. The figure was later reduced to 3. Himmler also undertook to raise the status of Russian prisoners and the Eastern workers within the Reich to the same level as those of other nationalities. But this was all happening far too late. Born of opportunism and despair, the Vlasov army was doomed to failure from the start. On February 10, 1945, the first 2 and only 2 Russian infantry divisions, numbers 600 and 650, were formally handed over to Lieutenant General Vlasov by General Kostring, who had succeeded Helmich as general of the volunteer units. The ceremony was attended by SS officials and party representatives, and by Colonel Herrer on my behalf. The Russian flag was hoisted next to our own, and these divisions' arduous path into their fatherland began. Vlasov's attempt to salvage them from the ruins of the Reich and to transfer them to the Western Allies were thwarted by the Allies themselves, since the Yalta Agreement bound all belligerents to surrender Allied prisoners to their countries of origin. Thus, he and his followers found themselves treading the bitter road into imprisonment, and eventually onto the gallows of their own country, which they had wanted to liberate from the yoke of Stalinism. If I survey the tragedy of the Vlasov movement now, after an interval of 25 years or more, I am bound to admit that given Hitler's manic ideas, the movement was doomed to failure from the start. All the effort Germans and Russians alike had invested in the movement had been for nothing. For countless Russians and their friends, like General von Panwitz, one of the divisional commanders, it meant being branded as traitors. The lesson I learned was that the psycho-political element cannot be suppressed in modern politics or warfare, and if it is not promptly and completely taken into account, or if the nature of modern war is misunderstood, then however great the means that are provided by a country for its armed forces, they will be wasted, and all sacrifice will be in vain. While Clausewitz could write of war as a continuation of politics by other means, Lenin followed this dictum with a rider of his own. Peace is only a continuation of war by other means. Politicians are not the only ones whom this concerns, but officers as well, and they should not just take an interest in the political implications once armed conflict has actually broken out, but during the years of peace that precede the conflict. Hitler had always declined to bother himself seriously with unpleasant facts and figures, and this tendency increased after the unsuccessful attempt on his life in 1944. He was interested only in hearing what fit in with his own train of thought, and was thrown completely off balance by the slightest contradiction. Even officers of a naturally contentious disposition like Halder and Guderian found it difficult to put conflicting opinions to him without being instantly interrupted. As I have already mentioned, I conferred with him only rarely, 4 times in all. Had I regularly accompanied the Chief of Staff and head of the operations branch into Hitler's war conferences, my dismissal would have probably occurred much earlier than it did. Except for when Hitler ordered me to attend the meeting, Zeitzler or Heusinger took my intelligence digests with them into the conference room and incorporated my findings into their own remarks. On the occasions when I did attend, I always stated my opinions forthrightly and unambiguously, while at the same time trying to speak in a language that Hitler's peculiar mind would understand. At the first 2 meetings, Hitler had listened to me with interest, but the more the war situation turned sour, the less he was inclined to heed his intelligence service. The wartime chief of the British Imperial General Staff, Lord Alanbrooke, refers frequently in his diaries to comparable difficulties he had with Winston Churchill. But whereas Churchill was an enthusiastic amateur strategist, to the horror of his colleagues, and extremely stubborn in arguing his ideas, unlike Hitler, he was ultimately open to persuasion. He rewarded his colleagues for sticking to their guns with his friendship and enduring loyalty. When someone argued persistently with Hitler that his plans were wrong and worse still, was proved right by events, Hitler soon found ways of getting rid of him. Admiral Canaris was a case in point. When an Abwehr agent defected to the British from Turkey early in 1944, thereby compromising Cicero, a famous Abwehr agent in Ankara, Walter Schellenberg cleverly fed the details to Hitler through Himmler's liaison officer at the Führer's headquarters. As he had been suspicious of Canaris for some time, Hitler seized this as a pretext to strip the admiral of his espionage organization. On February 12, 1944, he ordered, 1. A uniform German intelligence service is to be established. 2. I put the Reichsführer SS Himmler in charge of this German intelligence service. And 3. Insofar as this affects the military intelligence and counter-espionage service, the Reichsführer SS and the chief of the OKW are to take the necessary steps after due consultation. At first, Colonel Georg Hansen was assigned to head the Abwehr's intelligence arm, and from June 1st all Abwehr functions were transferred to the RSHA under Himmler and Schellenberg. Thanks to Keitel's intervention as chief of the OKW, we were fortunately able to retain all frontline intelligence work on the Eastern Front purely under the aegis of the army. In other words, it remained in my control. We appointed Colonel Buntrock, head of our frontline intelligence section, as liaison officer with the RSHA. He was an expert on military intelligence, and I had complete faith in him. In his new capacity, he was directly subordinate to Keitel. Schellenberg, however, was dissatisfied with our success in retaining these units and tried very hard to get complete control of military intelligence work and our frontline intelligence organization, which was controlled by Major Baun. The senselessness of such a step should have been obvious to him. The IC officers and the reconnaissance units reporting to them were parts of the military command structure. Had the Schellenberg proposals been put into effect, they would have meant the end of any kind of organized military command, as they would have destroyed one of the essential elements for making command decisions, the rapid, immediate and conscientious provision of intelligence on the enemy. The war came to an end, however, before Schellenberg could achieve his aims. I have always maintained that the active intelligence procuring agency needs a firm guiding hand, and that a correct assessment of the military situation can only be based on a steady flow of intelligence. In other words, it is often necessary for intelligence procurement to be directed to particular assignments, and it is equally necessary to avoid jumping to conclusions supported by an inadequate intelligence foundation. At the time, I could hardly have suspected that this mutual interplay of the procurement and analysis. Sides of intelligence work would decide the pattern of Germany's intelligence service after her defeat. By the spring of 1944, the military situation on the Eastern Front was so gloomy that I supplied our long-term intelligence digests only in sealed envelopes to other leading members of the General Staff and to Major Baun. I had to ask them not to show the reports to anybody else and to return the documents to me, in view of the way the enemy position is viewed therein. By March 28th, we had assembled enough Abwehr material to report that the Soviet offensive would be conducted without respite on every sector of the Eastern Front, and that the Russian command had been given the following objectives. They were to occupy Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. They were to advance through Romania to Hungary, Bulgaria, and Yugoslavia. And they were to occupy what had once been Poland. We knew all the details of Marshal Zhukov's military plans, and of his anxiety lest the Germans launch a counter-offensive from Galicia, and moreover we knew in detail of the orders issued to Marshal Koniev and General Malinovsky. In my summary issued 2 days later, on March 30th, 1944, I opened with the words, The present situation on the Eastern Front is overshadowed by the anticipated general enemy offensive against our Army Groups A and South. As it proceeds, a more menacing situation than ever before has emerged on the Eastern Front, and in the not-too-distant future, this may result in far-reaching political, military and economic repercussions on the rest of the war in Europe. I recommended that the only prospect of regaining the initiative lay in bold command decisions taken without regard to the loss of ground they might involve. I predicted that by occupying the Balkan countries, Poland and the Baltic states, the Russians would try to obtain by the end of 1944 a position on the very frontiers of the Reich. Hitler refused to sanction the necessary strategic withdrawals. He hung on to the Crimea until early May, when he was forced to order his troops to abandon their positions there. By early June, the Soviet armies had advanced to the frontiers of Poland, and all the indications were that they planned a major offensive against Army Group Center, commanded by Field Marshal Busch, which was defending Poland and East Prussia. On June 13th, I warned that the enemy had recently started introducing fresh strength into the areas facing the Army Group. Particular attention should be paid to the areas southeast and east of Bobruisk, on both sides of Chausi, along the highway northeast of Orsha, and on both sides of Vitebsk. These were the precise sectors of the front that were to be breached a few days later. The only information we could not ascertain with certainty was the date. I suggested, according to various items of information, there are at present increasing indications that the offensive will begin between June 15th and 20. But I added that Russian security was so good that we had never yet managed to predict the actual date and hour of an attack. The Soviet offensive began early on June 22nd, supported by 4,000 aircraft. Within a few days, the German front line had caved in, and within a month the Soviet armies were on the very frontiers of East Prussia. As I had also predicted on June 13th, a second phase of the Soviet offensive began a few days after the first, with a general attack on Lemberg, Lvov. A few days after the Soviet offensive began, on July 1st, 1944, I was stricken by severe blood poisoning and hospitalized at the field hospital at Angerburg. After a short sojourn there, I was transferred to a hospital in Breslau. It was this that probably resulted in my being overlooked by the Gestapo when their witch hunt after the unsuccessful bomb plot against Hitler began. I played no active part in the conspiracy, but it would be untrue were I to deny I knew that one was afoot. Some months before, my colleague General Husinger had hinted to me about the elements of the conspiracy in enough detail for me to gather what he was talking about. I regarded my own small task as being to ensure that the military intelligence organization was staffed only with officers upon whom we could count in such an emergency, and I asked Colonel Kleikamp of the personnel branch to make sure that I alone decided who was appointed to IC posts in the near future. I was also aware of the opposition within the army to Hitler. In the winter of 1941-42, I had a visit from the later General von Treschow, who was at the time operations officer of Army Group Center, and whom I knew well from Staff College. Comparing notes on the military situation, we both reached the conclusion that the campaign, and that meant the war as well, was bound to end in defeat, not because it could not be militarily or politically won, but because of Hitler's continued interference, which resulted in such elementary blunders that defeat was inevitable. We saw only one solution. Hitler would have to go. At the time, we had broken off this dangerous train of thought somewhat dismayed at our own presumption. We had, after all, sworn oaths of allegiance to Hitler, and we had grown up in the old Prussian officer tradition. After Husinger hinted to me that wheels were now moving, I discussed the actual tactics with my old regimental comrade General Helmuth Stief, who was by now head of the General Staff's organization branch. I stressed the importance of keeping the circle of accomplices as small as possible, and of preparing the coup d'état with extreme care if it was to succeed. Another of the conspirators, Colonel von Freytag-Loringhoven, called on me at the field hospital at Angerburg about 3 days before July 20th to warn me that the plot was now underway. Germans, and here one is probably entitled to generalizado, not make the best plotters. I believe it was Lenin, sitting in his sealed railway car in which the Germans transported him from Swiss exile back to Russia in 1917, who fumed, "If the Germans want to start a revolution, they buy a platform ticket first." My friends paid for the failure of the conspiracy with their lives. Freitag Loringhoven committed suicide, Stauffenberg was shot, and Stief was hanged. Colonel von Roen, who had transferred from my branch to take command of Foreign Armies West, was hanged in October for the part he had played. Fortunately, Colonel Wessel, my chief assistant, smashed open my filing cabinet at Angerburg and destroyed all the incriminating documents he found in them, particularly my correspondence with General Halder, who, like Husinger, was incarcerated for many months in a concentration camp after the failure of the plot. The ethics of the plot have subsequently exercised many minds, and resulted in much moralizing by both participants and bystanders. My own view is clear. I have always believed that Hig treason is high treason. It can be morally justified, however, by an exceptional national emergency, the only circumstance imaginable to me. Together with those of my friends who took the ultimate risk, I would accept that Hitler's pernicious leadership provided such an emergency. Given the rigidness of the Allied demand for unconditional surrender, however, it is difficult to see how the putsch could have succeeded in absolute terms. The plotters were certainly aware of this. A few weeks earlier, Colonel Hansen, who had originally headed the southeast section of Foreign Armies East for the first few months of my office, and trusted me implicitly, had come to see me at our headquarters in Angerburg about a very delicate affair. He confided to me that he, as Piekenbrock's successor in charge of Abwehr espionage, had arranged to meet an emissary of Churchill on a lonely road somewhere in southern France, and was going to put to him the all-important question of whether the British government would be prepared to negotiate an armistice with a new German government if Hitler were overthrown. Hansen returned some days later, having met the emissary as planned. I had never before seen him looking so dejected. The emissary had stated that the British position was that there could be no exception to the doctrine of unconditional surrender, and he was not empowered to talk about anything else. Hansen was executed with the rest of the plotters. For many years, my colleagues and I had trained ourselves to see things through the enemy's eyes, to think as he would think and calculate his intentions. From the start, we had sensed the growing Russian confidence in final victory, and now we could only agree that this confidence was justified. Early in October 1944, I told my more intimate colleagues that I considered the war was lost and we must begin thinking of the future. We had to think ahead and plan for the approaching catastrophe. These thoughts and discussions occupied us for many months, during which the burden of everyday work still had to be done. I was aided to an increasing extent by my deputy and successor, both in April 1945 and in May 1968, Lieutenant Colonel Gerhard Wessel. These dangerous internal conferences were aided by the solidarity of my staff, which had withstood many a crisis before. We were screened from hostile and curious fellow officers by the fact that we could rely unconditionally on each other. The older general staff officers were by and large hostile toward the regime and its ideology. This was not the case, however, with the rising generation of officers, particularly with the recently appointed National Socialist Leadership Officer, Hitler's emulation of the Soviet Commissar principle, which each unit and section now had to have. I had selected Major von Kalkreuth to act as our commissar, and when he protested to me that he could not reconcile this with his Christian ethics, I replied that that was precisely why I had chosen him. It had not escaped my attention that the war was taking its toll of many young officers' personal sets of values, and that the political indoctrination was resulting in either boundless National Socialism or an equally unbridled fatalism at the General Staff's headquarters. I recall that one of our female staff was a particularly fervent Nazi, until we gave her official clearance to listen to and monitor the British radio broadcasts. By the end of 1944, she had lost all her enthusiasm for Hitler. Guderian had done what he could to build up our military strength on the Eastern Front, but in the late summer of 1944, Hitler announced his plans for a major offensive in the Ardennes to his senior advisers, and large segments of Guderian's carefully built-up defences were dismantled to provide the forces Hitler needed in the west. The Ardennes offensive began on December 16th, while the Russians patiently waited with their own onslaught. Guderian and I could see it coming, and using our well-tried intelligence methods, we knew exactly where and with what strength the Russian blow would fall. Particularly valuable were the maps my branch prepared, showing the lines of communication between the Soviet agents on our side of the front line and their controllers in Russian territory. On December 24th, Guderian took these reports to Eagle's Nest, Hitler's western headquarters at Ziegenberg. But Hitler not only rejected his demand for massive reinforcement of the Eastern Front at the expense of this futile offensive in the west, but even dismissed our intelligence picture of the Soviet build-up as pure bluff. On the 31st, Guderian again warned Hitler in person that the Eastern Front was in danger of collapsing like a house of cards. Hitler indicated that he felt the Eastern Front was strong enough to cope with any Russian offensive. On January 8, 1945, I handed General Guderian a further appreciation of the situation drawn up by my branch. I recommended that we evacuate East Prussia if the rest of the Eastern Front, and that meant Berlin was to be held. The loss of East Prussia will hurt less than total defeat. I believed that the Soviet offensive would commence on or about January 12th. On January 12, 1945, the Soviet invasion began with an offensive by Marshal Koniev's First Ukrainian Front, followed by the Third White Russian Front on the 13th, and the First White Russian Front under Marshal Zhukov and the Second White Russian Front under Marshal Rokossovsky on the next day. Within a few days, the whole Eastern Front was in flames from the Upper Vistula to East Prussia. The most horrifying reports of Russian atrocities began to reach us. Early in December, a Ukrainian deserter had reported to one of my frontline units that in a Red Army briefing session in Warsaw, he and his comrades had been told that on Stalin's orders, robbing and looting were strictly forbidden in the occupied Polish territory, and they were to adopt a friendly attitude toward the Polish population, but that the Soviet troops were permitted to do what they wanted on German soil. My own family and the families of many of my colleagues were now in the path of this cruel Russian colossus. Hitler had strictly forbidden officers to evacuate their families to the west, but I could not stand by and leave mine to their fate. Besides, it was vital for my future mission to know that they were safe in the West. But it was a simple matter for an intelligence organization to forge the necessary movement papers, with the faked signature of the Gauleiter of Silesia. General Vlasov's troops helped them to load what they could onto some trucks. And on January 21st, my wife left Liegnitz in Silesia in a car driven by Major Baun with our 4 children, the youngest under 3, packed in the back. A small truck followed with their servant and some cases that were later robbed at Oberstdorf. They drove to Reichenbach in Silesia, where the Vlasov units were billeted on an estate. The next day they continued westward to Dresden, where Baun's wife ran a small hotel. The city was already filling with refugees, so they left again for Thuringia, where I had some relatives living at Rossbach, near Naumburg. It was fortunate that they did not stay in Dresden. For a few nights later, the city was devastated by an Allied saturation raid, in which over 100,000 civilians died, including the luckless wife of Major Baun. Baun himself had collected the files and archives of foreign armies east and drove several truckloads of them to Naumburg, where they were stacked in the empty wine cellars of the vineyards. There I thought that both my family and the files would be safe from Russian hands. Apart from these natural worries about our families, we were unconcerned about what fate held in store for us personally. This was hardly surprising, for we had managed by good intelligence work to obtain shortly after the Tehran and Yalta conferences full details of the Allied plans for destroying and partitioning Germany. We did not have much hope that the enemy coalition would fall apart immediately after the war, a vain hope that was widely believed in the front lines. But on the other hand, we could not accept either that this was the end for Germany. And it was this stoicism that encouraged me to apply my mind to the problems of the post-war period and what my duties to Germany then should be. Obviously, once our intelligence network had been broken up, it would be difficult, if not impossible, to reconstruct an efficient secret service for many years. Moreover, the longer the reconstruction took, the easier a communist enemy would find it to penetrate the new service. It might have seemed a pointless and illogical exercise to many in early 1945, but to me it was clear that if a new German intelligence service was going to emerge in the post-war period, there had to be as little interruption as possible. It was obvious to me that the future German government would need such a service. From the personnel angle, this would be possible only if we could resume our work immediately following the war, using my existing intelligence staff and my leading colleagues as a nucleus. There were considerations of foreign policy that also argued in favor of salvaging as much of our intelligence organization as possible. The face of communism had changed only in outward appearance, but its aims remained the same. Stalin had mobilized the energy of the Russian people by appealing to their patriotic instincts and by encouraging an imitation Soviet nationalism. Hitler's senseless Ostpolitik and his attitude toward the Russians had been grist for the Soviet dictator's mill. All our experience taught us that Stalin was not going to abandon his aims now, but would pursue his expansionist plans still further. His goal would continue to be the world revolution that was going to bring the blessings of socialism to all mankind. My staff and I anticipated that the need to defend the West would sooner or later force the West to make common cause with us against communism. Just when that would be, of course, we had no idea. We were strengthened in this conviction by a political appreciation drafted by Churchill, which reached us by devious means in February 1945. Perhaps I should indicate here that it is the duty of every sophisticated intelligence service to keep open a channel of communication with the enemy's intelligence service. Perhaps it may sound strange that while I was able to keep such channels active during the Third Reich, although it might have cost me my neck, I was unable to do so during the latter days of my work in the Federal Intelligence Service. Such contacts can often be of great advantage. I have already mentioned the channel we established to the British military mission in Moscow during 1943. It was through an even more direct channel that the British MI6, a military intelligence organisation, supplied us a copy of Mr. Churchill's Political Intelligence Appreciation of February 1945. When it landed on my desk at Zossen, I saw that Churchill's analysis viewed our position far too favourably in the East, but that it was entirely accurate in its picture of Soviet potential and intentions. The document indicated that the British did not share the optimism of their American allies on Uncle Joe's democratic qualities, and it revealed that they had few illusions about the future development of Poland and the Balkan countries, including Hungary, into Soviet satellites. I now believe MI6 supplied this document to us so that we might enable them to warn the British cabinet how exaggerated was the British estimate of our ability to withstand the Russian onslaught in the East. I informed General Guderian of the existence of this explosive document, and with his approval filed it with no further action. It was destroyed at the end of the war. On February 15th, the first sections of my branch, Foreign Armies East, transferred by railroad from Zossen to Reichenhall in Bavaria. 10 days later, I signed a further long-term summary of the enemy's intentions, in which I examined the probable main directions of the coming Soviet offensives, and the implications to be drawn from Marshal Zhukov's appointment as the supreme commander of the forces operating against us. While hitherto the Soviet Strategic Command has been guided almost exclusively by military considerations, I pointed out, it is now coming increasingly under the influence of political considerations. In this connection, we can clearly discern their endeavour to seize the appropriate positions of strength, regardless of any agreements reached in the Tehran and Yalta conferences, in order to confront their allies with a fait accompli as far as possible. I considered the object of the coming Soviet operations to be the destruction of our armies in the east and the rapid occupation of the central German industrial area around Leipzig and Halle. All the intelligence we received indicated that the primary thrust was to be expected from the sector between Görlitz and Schwedt, although there was still no indication as to when the Russians would resume their westward drive. While we were awaiting that moment, I turned over in my mind the various ways in which the Russians could be checked, and one unorthodox manner occurred to me. On March 3rd, 1945, I sent Guderian a note on the possibility of using huge forest fires as a weapon of war.